A university student stepped out for graduation night, tuxedo pressed and shoes polished. By the time the clock struck 12, he had vanished. No messages, no calls, just silence that felt wrong. But years later, during renovations under the old school stairwell, a worker noticed a hollow space. Something had been left there, intentionally or by accident, but it wasn't meant to be found. And when the object emerged from the shadows, it forced the town to ask questions they'd long ignored. Questions about that night Michael vanished. In 2006, there was a night everyone at the university had been counting down to for 4 years. Graduation night. Not the ceremony itself. That was already over. I mean the night after. The night when deadlines were finally done, dorm rooms half empty, and the future felt close enough to touch. That evening, the campus buzzed in a very specific way. Laughter spilling out of stairwells. Parents double-checking hotel keys. Friends promising, for the 100th time, that they'd stay in touch. The clock mattered that night. Everyone knew exactly where they were supposed to be and when. Photos at 6, dinner at 7. One last gathering before midnight. He had plans too. Clear ones. Simple ones. He left his dorm early, tuxedo hanging neatly from a garment bag, shoes still wrapped in tissue paper. He texted someone that he'd be there soon, therefore no one worried when they didn't see him right away. Graduation nights run late. They always do. The university looked beautiful that night. Old stone buildings glowing under soft lights. The central quad still warm from the afternoon sun. Music drifting from somewhere distant but familiar. It felt earned, like a finish line everyone crossed together. But as the hours passed, something subtle shifted. By 8, people started checking their phones. Not anxiously, casually. By 9, a few plans changed. Someone said he must have gone ahead. Someone else said he was probably already inside. Therefore, the night kept moving. At 10, the campus began to thin out. Parents headed back to hotels. Friends drifted toward bars just off university grounds. The kind of places that stayed open late for nights exactly like this. His phone didn't answer. But phones die, chargers get forgotten. Nobody panicked yet. Because this was graduation night. Because nothing bad was supposed to happen on a night like this. But midnight came anyway. And he still hadn't shown up. The last scheduled moment of the night passed quietly. No announcement, no alarm. Just the soft realization settling in that someone was missing from the picture that was supposed to close this chapter. His tuxedo was never seen that night. Not in photos, not on the dance floor, not draped over a chair. It simply didn't arrive. And while the campus lights dimmed and families packed their cars for the morning drive home, one question hung in the air unanswered. Where do you go when you leave for graduation night and never make it there? By nightfall, something felt off. Not in a way you could point to. Not yet. The campus was still alive, still loud in places, still glowing the way it always did on nights that mattered. But there was a thin crack in the rhythm, the kind you only notice when you've been somewhere long enough to know how it's supposed to sound. People kept assuming he was just late. That was the easiest explanation. Graduation nights stretch, conversations run long, one drink turns into 2. Therefore, no one said his name out loud with concern attached to it. Not yet. His dorm room door was still unlocked. The light inside was off, but his graduation program sat folded on the desk, untouched. The garment bag he'd carried earlier was gone, which felt reassuring at first. It meant he had left with intention, but the shoes weren't there either. Not under the bed, not by the door. That small detail sat quietly in the back of a few minds, unnoticed but recorded. By 9:30, a friend sent a message again. No reply. By 10, someone joked that he'd probably ditched everyone for an after-party. The joke landed. People laughed. Therefore, the night kept moving forward the way nights always do when no one wants to interrupt them. But patterns matter, even when we pretend they don't. He wasn't the kind of person who disappeared without saying something. He answered texts, he checked in, he liked plans, especially on nights that meant something. That thought surfaced briefly, then got pushed aside. Nobody wanted to be the first to say it felt strange. Outside, the university clock tower chimed. Once, then again. Each sound clean and calm. Nothing urgent about it. But time was moving, and he wasn't moving with it. By 11, the campus had shifted again. The loud places were louder. The quiet places were too quiet. A few friends stood near the steps of one of the older buildings, scanning faces as people passed. Each time someone unfamiliar walked by, there was a half-second of hope, then nothing. Therefore, the unease grew, but softly, like a thought you don't finish because finishing it would change the night. Phones were checked more often now. Not frantically, just more often than before. One friend stepped aside to make a call, then came back shaking his head, still calm on the surface. Probably bad signal, he said. No one argued, because graduation night wasn't supposed to include worry. But as the minutes slid toward midnight, one thing became impossible to ignore. He hadn't shown up anywhere. Not where he said he'd be, not where people assumed he'd gone, not anywhere that made sense. And that quiet absence, unannounced, unexplained, was the first sign that this night wasn't ending the way it was supposed to. This is Black Struggles, a place where stories like this are finally spoken out loud. But let's go back to that night. Because once the concern slipped past midnight, the tone changed without anyone agreeing that it had. No announcement, no group decision. Just a shared realization settling in slowly, like fog. By 12:30, the university felt different. The celebration had pockets now, not waves. Laughter in one corner, silence in another. A few students wandered back toward dorms, heels in hand, jackets draped over shoulders, replaying the night in pieces. Someone asked again if anyone had heard from him. Nobody had. Therefore, people started retracing steps. One friend walked the path from the quad to the old lecture halls, checking benches, stairwells, anywhere someone might have stopped to take a call or sit for a moment. Another stood near the parking structure, scanning cars as they pulled out, thinking maybe he'd left early without telling anyone. It all sounded reasonable. That's what made it unsettling. Because reasonable explanations were running out quietly. His phone still went straight to voicemail. Not ringing, not declining, just silence. Someone suggested checking his dorm again, not because they expected to find him there, but because doing something felt better than standing still. The room looked exactly the same as before. Bed untouched, desk neat. Nothing overturned, nothing missing except what he'd taken with him earlier. That was the problem. Everything pointed to him leaving on purpose. But nothing explained where he went after. Therefore, the questions shifted, not spoken fully, just halfway thoughts. Did he meet someone? Did plans change? Did something pull him off schedule for just a few minutes that turned into hours? Outside, campus security carts rolled by at their usual pace. No urgency, no flashing lights. Graduation weekend meant strange hours. People came and went. Nobody thought to stop one down. Not yet, because it still felt premature to say something was wrong. But the night was thinning out fast now. The bars off campus began to close. Music faded. The last clusters of students drifted apart with tired hugs and promises they wouldn't remember in the morning. And still, there was no sign of him. By the time the sky started to soften at the edges, that quiet discomfort had hardened into something heavier. Not panic, not fear. Just the growing certainty that this night had already taken a turn no one could undo. Earlier that evening, everything had followed a script so familiar it barely needed thought. The cap itched a little. Everyone complained about that. The gown felt heavier than expected, the fabric trapping warm air, as students shuffled across the courtyard, adjusting sleeves, tugging collars, stepping on hems. He kept checking the time on his phone, not because he was late, but because the night felt fragile, like something you didn't want to mishandle. The tuxedo wasn't his, it never is. Rented 2 days earlier from a small shop just off campus, the kind of place that smelled faintly of fabric spray and old carpet. The clerk had measured him quickly, marked a form, and said, "You'll look good. They always do." The shoes were stiff. The bow tie took 2 tries. Someone nearby offered help, fingers fumbling, laughing it off. Photos were supposed to be quick. Just a few. One with friends near the university sign, one under the oak trees lining the main walk, one more to send home before the ceremony even ended. His mother had already texted twice asking if he'd smiled. His aunt wanted a full-body shot. His younger cousin had asked if he could keep the cap. But the family wasn't there yet. They were waiting, watching the live stream from a living room miles away, counting the minutes until his name would be called, planning where to stand afterwards so they wouldn't miss him in the crowd. Someone had already started warming food. Someone else kept the phone charged on the coffee table. He said he'd call right after. That was the plan. After the ceremony, after the pictures, after he changed out of the gown and back into the tuxedo. Just one quick call, then he'd meet them. Then the night would really begin. He checked his reflection in a dark window near the science building, straightened the jacket, smoothed the lapel. It felt important to get that right. Graduation night does that to people, makes them careful. A friend asked where he was heading next. He smiled and gave a half answer, said he'd be back in a bit, said he just needed to take care of something first. Nothing dramatic, nothing final. Just one of those sentences you say without thinking, because you fully expect there to be a next one. But that was the last ordinary sentence anyone remembers him saying before he walked away, tuxedo sharp under the campus lights, carrying the night exactly the way it was supposed to be carried. And therefore no one thought to stop him. His mother, Evelyn Carter, sat in the living room, phone pressed loosely against her ear, not daring to dial again but also unable to stop herself from picking it up. The digital clock glowed 10:47 p.m., casting long shadows across the furniture, but her eyes were fixed on the doorway. She imagined him stepping in any second, tuxedo bag slung over his shoulder, hair still pressed perfectly, a smile she could almost see. She tried to distract herself, reheated the small plate of shrimp scampi she'd been saving, set it carefully on the side table, checked the thermostat, adjusted the fan, anything to fill the silence. But the house had grown heavier with each passing minute. Every creak of the floor sounded suspicious. Every wind gust rattling the windows carried possibility. By 11:15, hope was still there, but it had started to thin. She rationalized. Maybe he'd gotten caught up with friends. Maybe traffic had slowed him. Maybe the ceremony ran late. But each maybe felt less convincing than the last. She whispered into the dark, "Just be home soon." The words were more for herself than anyone else. The phone buzzed on the table. Another missed call from a friend. She picked it up this time. A soft voice on the other end. "He's not answering?" Evelyn shook her head, even though they couldn't see her. "No, he usually calls." Therefore, the weight of waiting pressed harder. She walked to the window and looked out at the empty street. The campus lights in the distance flickered, illuminating cars that carried strangers, not her son. The wind tugged at the blinds. She imagined it pulling him somewhere she couldn't reach. By midnight, rationalizations were fragile. She replayed every small memory from the afternoon, how he adjusted the collar of his shirt, how he laughed at a joke in the parking lot, how he promised to be careful. She could almost hear him now, but every imagined sound was hollow, echoing in the quiet house. She called the dorm once more. No answer. The operator was polite, professional, unconcerned. Just routine. The lack of urgency felt like a slap she wasn't prepared for, but she swallowed, breathing shallow because she had to. By 12:30 a.m., Evelyn was pacing. Phone back in her hand. Tears came quietly, unannounced. She sat back down, curling into the edge of the couch, staring at the empty doorway. Each passing minute stretched longer than the last. She repeated one desperate prayer she didn't know how else to say. Please, let him just be safe. And yet the night refused to offer reassurance. Something had shifted, something small, almost imperceptible, but enough to let her know that this night, the one she'd imagined would end with hugs and photos, was not ending the way it was supposed to. Therefore, the waiting became its own punishment, a slow unraveling of hope measured in seconds, each one louder than the last. Evelyn finally drove herself to the campus security office. The parking lot nearly empty now, except for a few latest staff. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as she stepped inside, her stomach tight. Behind the counter, a young officer looked up, half smile, half indifference. I need to report my son missing, she said, voice trembling but firm. She gave him the name, the dorm, the time he was last seen. She told him about the tuxedo, the cap, the graduation photos plan. Every detail, hoping it would matter. The officer nodded slowly, typing, glancing at a monitor, then back at her. He's 18, ma'am, he said lightly. He's probably celebrating with friends somewhere. Happens every year. His tone was calm, reassuring, but it carried a subtle dismissal. He didn't look alarmed. He didn't ask for her phone number twice. He didn't offer to call around. But he always checks in, Evelyn said, her hands curling into fists. He never misses a call. The officer shrugged, glancing at the screen again. Right. Well, we'll note it. I'll make a report, send it up the chain. Someone might check in later or not. Hard to say. He tapped a few keys, printed a short form, slid it across the counter. The form was perfunctory, cold, just a few lines of data, no urgency, no protocol checklist. Evelyn asked if there would be a campus alert, something to get the word out to dorms or security teams. The officer hesitated. We don't really do that for 18-year-olds unless there's evidence of foul play. Most just run late, stay at friends' apartments. They turn up eventually. She tried again. There's a ceremony tonight. He wouldn't just disappear. Something could have happened. He leaned back slightly, tired eyes flicking toward the hallway. Again, he's 18. He's probably celebrating. Probably fine. If he's not back by morning, we can revisit. But Evelyn left with a printed form and a hollow sense of bureaucracy. There was no urgency in the office, no sense of alarm. No one seemed to grasp that the missing person wasn't just a student skipping a party. He was someone's child. Someone's life paused in a frozen moment. Therefore, the system itself became a kind of quiet obstacle. Every procedure, every polite dismissal, subtly reinforced that the worry, the panic, the very human fear she felt, wasn't meant to register in the official world. By the time she returned home, the digital clock read 1:03 a.m. The house was quiet, the shrimp scampi cold. She dialed friends, dorm mates, anyone who might have seen him, but most phones went straight to voicemail. The weight of indifference lingered. And yet in that silence, the institution's failure spoke louder than any alarm ever could. The forms, the phrases, the casual shrug, they were not mere inefficiency. They were the world's way of telling her, softly but firmly, someone like him could vanish, and it would barely register. 18 years later, the same university sat under a winter sun that glinted off cracked windows and chipped railings. The halls were quieter now, the buzz of graduation ceremonies replaced by occasional students hurrying between classes. But the stairwell, room 214's flight, the one where everyone used to crowd during cap and gown check-ins, looked almost frozen in time, as if it were still waiting for him to appear. The paint peeled in long strips. The old wooden handrails were worn smooth, the varnish long gone. Scuff marks ran along the tile, the echoes of footsteps from decades past lingering faintly in the damp air. Where once balloons and congratulatory banners had hung, there was only a dull white wall, faint stains from water damage tracing unpredictable lines down the surface. Maintenance crews had patched sections of drywall haphazardly over the years. Electrical wiring hung slightly loose in corners, and the fluorescent lights buzzed inconsistently. Students walked by, heads down, backpacks slung low, oblivious to the history etched into the surfaces they passed. The janitor, Curtis Dane, now older, paused near the stairwell for the first time in years. He'd worked in these halls back then, sweeping, mopping, moving boxes, noticing everything everyone else ignored. He ran a hand along the rail, tracing the familiar bumps and grooves. He remembered the excitement that had once filled the building, and he remembered the night that had changed everything, though at the time no one realized it. The stairwell smelled faintly of mildew and floor polish, a combination that should have felt normal, but instead carried a weight he couldn't shake. Even the wind that slipped through the cracked windows seemed to whisper fragments of memory, laughter, hurried footsteps, a sense of anticipation that had never been fulfilled. Therefore, walking these halls now felt like stepping into a space caught between eras. Time had worn down the walls, but it hadn't erased the absence. Every scuff mark and faded stain seemed to echo a story no one had heard, a night that had been ignored, and a child who had never returned. And still, the stairwell waited. The echo of something left behind lingered in the air, unseen but almost tangible. It was a quiet reminder that the passage of years did not heal the past. It only deepened the shadows of what had been forgotten. Curtis stopped mid-step, eyes narrowing at a faint bulge along the side of the stairwell wall. Something didn't belong. Something had been left there long ago, ignored, and for the first time in nearly 2 decades, he felt a stir of dread he hadn't felt in years. But what it was exactly he didn't know, and when he reached out, brushing the edge of the wall, he felt the first hint of the secret that had been waiting all this time. Curtis Dane had been sweeping the stairwell for nearly an hour when he noticed something odd. He was no longer a young custodian fresh out of college. The years had etched lines into his face and dulled the spring in his step. But habits die hard. He carried his broom along the edge of the landing, sweeping dust into neat piles, when the bristles caught on something stiff behind the baseboard. At first, he thought it was just a forgotten poster tube or a discarded jacket left behind by a careless student. But the shape was wrong. It was folded too neatly, pressed too intentionally into the narrow cavity between the wall and the stairwell support beam. He crouched down, brushing aside dust and old gum wrappers, and his fingers hit something smooth and cool. Pulling it free, he stumbled backward, hard hammering. There it was, a tuxedo, dark and faded, its satin lining dulled by years of neglect, the jacket pressed tight, the pants folded with precision. The bow tie had yellowed, still pinned to the collar. Curtis blinked. It didn't make sense. He held it up, examining it in the flickering fluorescent light. There was no tag inside, just a small monogram stitched on the jacket lining. M.J. Peters. Curtis felt a chill crawl up his spine. He had swept these halls countless times, polished every corner, and never once noticed anything like this. Therefore, the discovery felt less like a finding and more like a confrontation. The wall, the stairwell, the decades, they had conspired to hide the secret. And now, almost casually, the truth had surfaced in the hands of someone entirely ordinary. Someone the world would never have expected to stumble into history. Curtis sat the tuxedo down on the steps, leaning back against the railing. The silence of the empty hall pressed in. No alarms went off. No one was waiting to notice. It was just him, the tuxedo, and the knowledge that something unimaginable had been tucked away here, unseen for 18 years. He ran a hand over the fabric, feeling the weight of every stitch, every crease, every forgotten fold. And somewhere in the back of his mind, a memory nudged him. Graduation night. The laughter, the cameras, the excitement that had once filled the stairwell. He hadn't understood it then, but now, holding this tuxedo, he felt the absence of a young man, the silence of a celebration that never happened, and the quiet scream of a story that had waited far too long to be told. But what had happened to him? Why here, hidden in plain sight? Curtis knew only one thing for certain. The past had been patient, and now it had finally chosen to speak. The tuxedo lay on the worn stairwell step, almost surreal in the harsh fluorescent light. Dark navy, almost black, the fabric had dulled to a lifeless hue after 18 years. The jacket's shoulders were crushed slightly, the creases suggesting it had been shoved into the narrow cavity with care, or perhaps force. Dust clung to the satin lapels, and faint streaks of rust-colored stains marred the lining, patterns that made no immediate sense. The pants were folded neatly beneath the jacket, the creases sharp, as if someone had wanted them to stay pristine, or at least appear so. The bow tie, still attached to the collar, had yellowed at the edges, the stiff silk now brittle enough that it might crumble under a careless touch. The faint smell of dampness clung to the material, mixed with something metallic, like old pennies or iron nails. something industrial and forgotten. A small label stitched inside the jacket read, "M.J. Peters," neat cursive, the thread fraying at the corners, but still readable. It was the only hint of identity, a quiet signature left behind, waiting for someone to notice. Every fold, every stain, every imperfection told a story, even if the story itself remained hidden. Curtis crouched closer, running his fingers along the sleeve. He noticed the slight tear at the elbow, a faint smear of dust and grit caught in the fibers, almost as if the jacket had brushed against concrete or stone. The cuffs were still crisp, buttons intact, though one had loosened over the years. Each detail screamed of being cared for or preserved, yet in the wrong place, in the cold shadow of a stairwell where no one should have left it. Therefore, the tuxedo became more than fabric. It became witness, messenger, ghost. It held the weight of absence, the evidence of time passing in a space that should have remained ordinary. No one had asked it questions. No one had noticed it. Yet here it was, waiting, offering proof through every wrinkle, every faded stitch. And while Curtis could see all of this, the color, the folds, the smells, the label, he still didn't understand why it had been hidden. He only knew that it had been there, silently observing the years, until he came along and finally pulled it into the light. The tuxedo had stories to tell, if only someone could hear them. But what exactly had it seen? Curtis didn't know, and that question hovered in the stairwell air, thick as the dust that clung to the jacket, demanding answers it refused to give. Evelyn Carter had been waiting for a call all day, her hands fidgeting with the strap of her purse as she sat in the quiet kitchen of her Westbrook home. 18 years, 18 birthdays, 18 graduations, 18 ordinary mornings and evenings spent wondering, questioning, hoping for something she had long stopped believing she would ever see. She had rehearsed 1,000 scenarios in her head, each one more impossible than the last. But she told herself she could handle anything. Then her phone rang. "Ma'am, you need to come see this," said the voice on the other end, calm but with a weight that made her stomach drop. No details. Nothing. Just that she needed to come. Evelyn didn't ask questions. She didn't need to. Something inside her knew this wasn't routine. Something told her that what awaited her would pull at the very edges of her heart. Therefore, she grabbed her keys and left. The drive to the university was a quiet one, the streets unusually empty for a late afternoon. Sunlight stretched long and thin across the cracked asphalt. Every red light felt like it had been placed to give her more time to think, more time to imagine what she might find. She pictured a folded sweatshirt, maybe an old backpack, something mundane. But even as she told herself not to hope, her mind betrayed her. She imagined the sharp crease of a tuxedo jacket, the shine of shoes he had polished for hours before graduation, the bow tie he struggled to get straight in the mirror. But these thoughts were only ghosts. Nothing could prepare her. Every mile brought 1,000 what-ifs pressing into her chest. What if it's nothing? What if it's just a joke? What if... No, she couldn't let herself finish that thought. She gripped the steering wheel tighter, knuckles white. The university came into view, its brick halls bathed in golden light. Same halls he had walked, same stairwells he had climbed on that fateful day. Everything familiar, yet everything distant. Therefore, she parked and stepped out, boots crunching on gravel. She felt like she was moving through water, each step slower than the last. The maintenance worker met her halfway, expression tight, hesitant. "It's right here," he said, motioning toward the stairwell. Evelyn's breath caught, and there it was, his tuxedo. Navy blue, dulled with dust, bow tie still pinned, satin lapels folded with care. The smell of age and must hit her instantly. Her knees went weak. She clutched the railing as if it could keep her anchored. Her chest heaved, breath coming in short, shallow bursts. Every fold, every stitch, every faint mark along the sleeve carried him back to her mind. The morning of graduation, the careful adjustment of his tie, the shine of his shoes, the nervous smile he practiced in the hallway mirror. But recognition didn't need evidence. Her eyes traced the folds of the tuxedo again. The pants were still sharp at the creases, the buttons faintly polished in a way only someone meticulous could have done. And in that moment, Lorraine knew without doubt that this had belonged to her son. No police confirmation, no forensic report, no stain analysis. Her body recognized it before her mind could. Her chest heaved, a single breath catching and spilling into the stairwell, like a confession she hadn't realized she'd been holding. She whispered his initials under her breath, barely audible. Michael. J. Carter. Her son. The name felt alive again, carried in the threads, folded and forgotten for 18 years. Therefore, she realized this was only the beginning. The tuxedo was not just fabric, it was a story waiting to be told, a question pressing for answers. Evelyn Carter stood there, breathless, anchored to a moment that had begun nearly 2 decades ago, and knew that the truth, whatever it was about to surface. But as Evelyn Carter stood in the quiet hallway, her fingers brushing over the dusty tuxedo, Michael's face came to her mind like it had every night for 18 years. The memory of him in a borrowed jacket, eager for graduation night, the same smile she had kissed that morning. She felt it all, painfully vivid. She thought of all the nights she had driven through the dark streets near their home, calling his name aloud to the empty wind, repeating the same hope that he was still out there somewhere. Therefore, the discovery of the tuxedo did more than shock her. It unlocked everything she had been carrying silently. For years, her search for Michael had taken her far beyond this town. She had spoken with mothers, fathers, and grandparents whose children had vanished under circumstances eerily similar to his. At first, she had tried to keep the focus on him, asking carefully, "Have you noticed anything unusual? Did your child disappear suddenly?" Each story, though not hers, echoed what she had lived. But with every conversation, she saw reflections of Michael in those lost children. The same age, the same quiet ambitions, the same dismissed disappearances. But it wasn't just a series of stories. It was the same indifference repeating itself. She remembered the mother of Jasmine Lowe in Meridian, who told her quietly how authorities assumed her daughter was a runaway. She thought of Ayanna Green's aunt in Tuscaloosa, who held photographs and letters that no one had ever bothered to file properly. And Lisa Monroe's father, who shook his head at Evelyn, whispering how the police told him, "She'll return when she's ready." But Michael had never returned. And the pattern, the cruel repetition, hit her like a weight she had carried alone for 18 years. Therefore, Evelyn began piecing it all together. She traced dates, towns, bus stops, schools, and abandoned motels. She mapped every detail Michael's absence had forced her to notice. In every conversation, she introduced Michael naturally, a constant reminder of why she was here, why her questions mattered. "My son, Michael, went missing the same way," she told each parent softly. "I've been searching for him all these years." And slowly a network of sorrow and frustration opened up around her. Mothers and fathers shared the same disbelief she had known. Reports filed, ignored, calls made, dismissed, hope fading unnoticed. But Evelyn didn't stop at listening. She documented every conversation, every photograph, every scrap of evidence she could gather, always in relation to Michael. She compared timelines, noted similarities, and marked patterns that might lead her back to him. When she met Ayanna's mother in that tiny living room, tea cooling on the table, she spoke of Michael's last known steps, the tuxedo, the university stairwell. She noticed how the stories of other children mirrored the pain she had carried, but she never let them overshadow her search for her own son. Therefore, by the time she was asked to come see the tuxedo, Evelyn didn't need anyone to tell her the gravity of what she was about to witness. Driving through familiar streets, past the old university halls and the worn staircases, she thought of every parent she had met along the way, every missed phone call, every unanswered report, but always at the center was Michael. She imagined what he might have felt that night, what she might have said, what the last moments she had shared with him had meant. But now, standing before the staircase where the tuxedo had been hidden, everything clicked into place. The jacket wasn't just a relic. It was evidence of a long-forgotten neglect, a pattern she had traced through the lives of other children. Yes, but Michael was the reason she had kept looking, the reason she had not let it go. Therefore, the network of dismissed cases, Forgotten names and quiet indifference she had navigated for years converged into a single, undeniable truth. Michael Carter's disappearance was not an accident, and it was not isolated. And as she breathed in the faint smell of old fabric and mildew, Evelyn realized something she had never allowed herself before. She had carried the story of Michael for years, but now, every name she had recorded, every face she had remembered, every meeting she had attended with other parents all pointed to the same conclusion. He was gone, but he had left a trail, and that trail was about to reveal more than she had ever imagined, not just about Michael, but about the system that had allowed him to disappear. But nothing could erase the years of absence. The university stairwell was silent now, dust motes drifting in sunlight, the echo of footsteps long gone. The tuxedo sat in a clear evidence bag, sealed, folded, its creases telling a story Michael Carter would never get to tell himself. The discovery was undeniable, but it wasn't closure. It was a signpost pointing to questions that refused to be answered. Therefore, Evelyn stood there, hands gripping the railing, staring at the jacket. She remembered the 18 years of searching, every dead-end call, every cold hallway, every night spent listening for a sound that never came. But now, finally, the truth had arrived without fanfare. Someone had hidden it, deliberately. Someone had made sure the world would forget. But why? And where was he? Where was Michael? The questions clung like dust to her sleeves. But the authorities were moving slowly. Detective Riddell had spent hours examining the stairwell, the foundation, every worn edge where the jacket had rested. He could confirm its authenticity. He could record it, but he couldn't make it speak. No fingerprints, no DNA, no confession. Just the fabric, the folds, and the label that read, M. Carter. The evidence said what had been ignored for decades. Michael Carter had vanished, and someone had chosen to keep it that way. Therefore, Evelyn returned home that evening carrying the evidence photos. She placed them on her dining room table, alongside the stack of notes she had gathered from parents across 3 states. Each story, each missing child, connected in a pattern she had traced for years. She realized she could not unsee what she now knew. Michael's disappearance was not an accident, and it was not isolated. But it also meant there was no quick justice. No one to point a finger at with certainty. Only the truth that refused to be comfortable. But she didn't leave the house. She sat at the window watching the empty street, imagining Michael walking home after school, imagining him laughing, thinking graduation night would be his first real taste of freedom. And she thought of all the parents she had met, the ones who had been told, they'll come back, or probably just a runaway. She remembered the anger, the disbelief, the quiet despair that mirrored her own. And she understood something that no report, no investigation could change. Some truths are heavier than justice. Therefore, the community began to stir. Rumors spread. Local news ran the photos of the jacket. Parents and students whispered about what had been hidden all those years. But the open loops remained. Michael Carter's body was missing. No confession had arrived. No one knew if Curtis Dane had acted alone, or if Reggie Clay's presence was more than coincidence. Each question multiplied the weight of the discovery, each answer still unspoken. But Evelyn felt a strange calm, not peace, not resolution, just clarity. The fabric of the tuxedo, the evidence of his absence, had surfaced. That was undeniable, and for the first time in 18 years, the truth wasn't buried. Michael had been here. Michael had mattered, and therefore she would carry that knowledge forward, not as closure, but as proof that what had been ignored could still be seen. And somewhere in that silence, Evelyn understood what the past had tried to teach her. Justice might fail, bodies might never be recovered, confessions might never come, but truth has a way of surfacing, even if it comes folded in a dusty tuxedo 18 years later. But the story didn't end with Michael Carter. It never had. It ended with the realization that some children are seen and some are not. Some disappearances spark headlines, flashing lights, and national alerts. Others vanish into shadows, ignored by systems, overlooked because no one expected their absence to matter. But Michael mattered, and therefore the jacket, folded, dusty, hidden for 18 years, was not just evidence. It was a mirror of who the world chose to look for and who it chose to forget. But that truth is uncomfortable. It's heavy, quiet, and persistent. It asks why Evelyn had spent years tracing every lead, meeting parents of other missing teenagers, black, brown, poor, invisible in public memory, while the world moved on. Why the calls went unanswered, the tips dismissed, the flyers filed and ignored. Why some children's absence carries weight and others' silence is assumed. But here it was, laid bare in the folds of a tuxedo, stitched with a name that could not be erased. Therefore, the lesson isn't about justice, arrest, or resolution. It's about recognition, about the fact that the stories of children like Michael Carter are worth noticing, worth remembering, worth holding tightly even when the world looks away. And the discomfort of that truth lingers long after the cameras leave, long after reporters type their headlines. It doesn't ask to be liked, it demands to be seen. But seeing it doesn't fix what was lost. It doesn't bring back the laughter in hallways, the careful preparation for cap and gown, the ordinary nights that were stolen without trace. It only proves one thing: neglect leaves a mark, silence leaves a scar, and therefore every missing child, every story left untold, is a reflection of what society chooses to ignore until something like a jacket, folded and dusty, forces recognition. And so the story closes not with answers, but with this. Michael Carter was searched for too late, noticed too late, and remembered because someone refused to forget. But the wider truth, the one that echoes in hallways, stairwells, and motel walls across the country, is that some children disappear quietly. And unless someone insists on seeing them, the world simply lets them go. Some disappearances are ignored not because they are unimportant, but because society chooses who is worth searching for. Through Michael Carter's story, viewers see the long-lasting impact of systemic neglect, the quiet suffering of families, and the courage of those who refuse to forget. They'll understand that objects, like a hidden tuxedo, can carry stories, memories, and truths that official channels overlook. The story challenges assumptions about safety, justice, and visibility, reminding viewers that every missing child matters, and that remembering, questioning, and demanding answers is the first step toward recognition, even if resolution never comes.